Hi everyone, welcome to part 4 of the digestive. So if you remember from part 3, we were discussing the gross anatomy of the mouth. Now let's talk a little bit about the digestive processes of the mouth. So first off is ingestion, right? We eat, we masticate, we chew, okay? The second thing that the mouth does is start the mechanical breakdown of the food that we are eating by chewing. Don't forget that the other portion of the digestive system that does mechanical breakdown is the stomach when it does the churning. We also initiate propulsion by swallowing, right? We swallow that bolus of food. And then we start the digestion of polysaccharides. So remember, we've already discussed salivary amylase. And so this is the beginning of the digestion of polysaccharides. Now, in general, absorption does not occur in the mouth. However, there are a few things that can be absorbed through the mouth, such as nitroglycerin, and then there's also a B12 supplement that you can put under your tongue, and it helps absorption of that. All right, so now let's talk about the process of mastication itself. If you take it apart, you already understand how this works, okay? But with it written down, what we see is that the cheeks and lips have to be closed in order for you to chew and the food stay in your oral proper. The tongue mixes the food with saliva and helps to soften it. And then, of course, your teeth grind the food into smaller morsels. Now, mastication is partly voluntary and partly reflexive. If you ever tried to chew Jell-O, hello, some of us have done it frequently. It's because you've got something in your mouth and that something causes you to have a reflex that makes you want to chew. All right, a couple other things I wanted to point out on mastication. You guys remember the muscles. So you remember the temporalis muscle here, right? And then also the masseter. So the two of these muscles working together help to bring that mandible up, okay? Now, on the second picture, let's look here. You've got buccinator muscles. The buccinator muscles and the orbicularis oris help to keep the food in the oral cavity proper, okay? So you might want to remember those muscles and what they do. Now talking about the pharynx. We've already talked quite a bit about the pharynx as it is. But now we're going specifically more into the oropharynx and the laryngopharynx, okay? So obviously this area allows the passage of food, and because we're talking about the passage of food, we obviously need to have that abrasion-resistant stratified squamous epithelium again. But don't forget about our little goblet cells that help to lubricate the bolus to help it go down. Now in the pharynx, the muscularis externa has the two layers of muscles. You've got that inner layer of muscle that will run longitudinally. The outer layer of muscle in this area circles the pharynx, and they both work together to propel the food into the esophagus. So now let's look at the esophagus itself. Okay. Remember when we were looking at it in the rat, you could see, and when you looked straight into the rat, you could see the trachea first, right? You had those cartilage rings. It was very obvious because it was being held open by that hyaline cartilage. The esophagus was flattened behind the trachea, okay? So whenever there's no food there, the esophagus is completely collapsed, okay? Now, the esophagus pierces the diaphragm at the esophageal hiatus, okay? And then the esophagus joins the stomach right here in this area where we call it the cardinal orifice. Now, a big important part in this whole area is going to be your gastroesophageal sphincter, okay? Gastro for stomach, and then the esophageal because it's coming from the esophagus. This sphincter, it's not actually like a valve. It is basically that ring of circular tissue that's somewhat thickened. And what it does is by having that sphincter as well as the diaphragm, it helps this area so that when the food is in the stomach churning, it's supposed to prevent food and that acidic chyme from going back up into the esophagus. It doesn't always work. We've all experienced that where maybe we've eaten a little too much, the churning's going on, and then all of a sudden we've got really bad heartburn, right? So that is the gastroesophageal sphincter that occasionally can, allow a little bit of acid up into our esophagus and it burns. Okay. Now, I do want to point out too, we do have mucus cells on both sides of that sphincter to help protect our esophagus from the acid reflux, but after a while, sometimes it doesn't seem to work quite as well, probably because we've eaten too much and the mucus is kind of. All right, so moving on. The esophagus does have all four of the layers, are all four tunics, okay? The esophageal mucosa, again, contains stratified squamous epithelium, right? We've got something that's abrasive, so we've got that abrasive resistant stratified squamous. Now, here's the thing. When you go from the esophagus down into the stomach, you're going to change. So right there at that gastroesophageal junction, you're going to have the stratified squamous epithelium on top, and then you're going to have the simple columnar where it changes over to the stomach. So let's look here real quickly at this histology image, okay? You can see this area right here, all of this in here is going to be your stratified squamous. So you can see the obvious change right here between that stratified squamous to the simple columnar epithelium of the stomach. So if we were able to go to lab, this is one of the slides that we would look at, and you would be able to see that junction, and then you'd have to identify, would the pointer be on the stratified squamous of the esophagus, or is it on the simple columnar of the stomach? All right, so moving on. We have esophageal glands in the submucosa that also, again, help secrete mucus, right? And then on our tunic, the muscularis externa, you've got skeletal muscle in the top part of the esophagus. It's mixed with smooth muscle in the middle, and then you've got entirely smooth muscle at the inferior portion of the esophagus where it comes up right next to the stomach. All right, so let's look at the digestive processes. Okay, now swallowing, right? We do that pretty involuntarily, okay? So the thing or one of our definitions here is deglutination, okay? So swallowing is called deglutination, and it involves 22 different muscle groups, okay? There's two different phases. One is the buccal phase, and the other is the pharyngeal esophageal phase. Now, one thing to keep in mind when we're talking about the buccal phase, okay, it says there's the voluntary contraction of the tongue. However, when you move the tongue and it shoves, I'm looking at this picture here, you have the tongue in the buccal phase, the tongue is going to come up to the roof of your mouth, and as it does, it shoves that bolus of food toward that anterior portion of your mouth, okay? When it does so, it's going to initiate the next phase because that anterior portion of the pharynx has tactile receptors. So as soon as that food touches that area, those tactile receptors will cause the reflexive swallowing to get the bolus of food to go down into the esophagus, okay? Let's look a little bit closer, okay? So here we have our buccal phase here, okay? And again, the tongue presses against the hard palate, causes that bolus of food to move back. That bolus of food touches the back of the pharynx and triggers that reflex to cause you to swallow. And then in the swallowing, the pharyngeal esophageal phase, you've got the tongue completely blocking the mouth. You've got the soft palate and the uvula rise in order to block off that nasopharynx. But then you've also got the larynx itself is going to rise up, and as it does, the epiglottis will block the trachea so that the bolus of food that you are swallowing goes right down into the esophagus. Okay? So once the food gets into the esophagus, you can see that the muscles of the pharynx contract. That keeps that bolus of food from going back up, okay? Because we only want that bolus of food to go down. Once it gets past a certain point, you've got peristalsis taking over, and it forces that bolus of food further down. And then once we get down toward the stomach, okay, here we're going to come into that gastroesophageal sphincter, okay? So as that bolus of food is coming down and we've got the peristalsis pushing it down, it will cause that gastroesophageal sphincter, excuse me, to relax. And when the sphincter relaxes, that allows that bolus of food to enter the stomach, okay? All right, so question for this one. What type of tissue is found on the esophageal side of the gastroesophageal junction? And what type of tissue is found on the stomach side of the gastroesophageal junction?